Right, come here to me. Before we get started, thank you so much to all the new supporters on Patreon, as well as to everyone who increased their support. We're now 2/3 of the way to making this a sustainable worker co-op, and we want to thank yous all from the bottom of our hearts for making this possible. Thanks to you, I can now pay my bills this month, which, not gonna lie, massive relief. Much appreciated, Gurmiel Mahagwith.
Thank you, everyone. Hundreds of millions of people have been rushing to the movie theaters in the past 2 months to see the incredibly popular American film Oppenheimer.
A biographical film, it follows the career of American physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, including involvement in the Manhattan Project and later fall from grace during his 1954 McCarthyite security hearing, which looked into his communist affiliations and revoked his security clearance, barring him from government roles for the rest of his life and from any decision-making power regarding the usage and proliferation of his own creation.
Despite both praise and criticism levied at the film, it has sparked a lot of worldwide discussions around the unethical and oppressive nature of anti-communist persecution and the frightening reality of possible nuclear war.
Nice, light-hearted stuff. And we'll continue these relaxed vibes as we take a look at the politics of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, how it deals with communism and anti-communism, as well as the film's own political bias and the political messages that it's attempting to convey. Is it fascism? Is it anarchism? All will be revealed today. But first, let me ask you a question. Are you tired of being tracked online after Google searching Marxism one too many times and getting put on a list? Want access to your favourite content from anywhere in the world? Looking to save some cashish while shopping online? Then you need Atlas VPN. For a limited time, you can grab the big deal and get Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.83 per month, with 3 months extra thrown in for free. Unlock your favourite content from around the globe on platforms like Netflix with Atlas VPN. Save big while shopping online. Get the best deals on subscriptions, flights, hotels, and more. Keep your Google searches private with Atlas VPN. No more prying MI5 eyes, just good old-fashioned organic search results. And this is much more than just a VPN. It blocks all malicious links, ads, and trackers, and notifies you when someone is trying to steal your data. Atlas VPN keeps you secure when browsing the web. Ha! Not today, CIA! Best of all, with just one subscription, you get unlimited protection to use Atlas VPN on all your devices. Don't miss out on this fantastic limited time deal. Protect your privacy and enjoy all the benefits of Atlas VPN Premium for just $1.83 per month, with 3 months extra thrown in for free. That's free, baby! Plus, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get started now! Click on the link in the description box below to secure your Atlas VPN Premium subscription, but act fast as this is a limited time offer. Stay secure online and stay out of jail with Atlas VPN. A massive thanks to the champs over at Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video. These fellas help us get closer to a minimum wage so that we can keep making these videos for yous. And now, back to business. So who was J. Robert Oppenheimer?
So this man, J. Robert Oppenheimer, he was a 20th century American physicist who played a crucial role in leading the Manhattan Project. This research and development undertaking produced the very first nuclear weapons, which would later be dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, by the United States. The first and only wartime uses of nuclear weapons in history. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born to a wealthy Jewish family in New York. A second-generation immigrant, his father, Julius Oppenheimer, had immigrated by himself from Prussia as a teenager to New York City, eventually becoming an executive at a textile factory. Meaning that J. Robert Oppenheimer, unlike his father, Julius Oppenheimer, had a pretty privileged upbringing. He went to private school during his childhood and teenage years, and then he got his undergraduate degree in chemistry at Harvard University before earning his PhD at the University of Göttingen, Germany, and becoming a professor of quantum mechanics at UC Berkeley. The man was a total nerd. An incredibly brilliant guy. Just the right guy that the United States would need to be able to develop these nuclear weapons. But there was only one problem.
Over the course of the 1930s, the US was reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Simultaneously, fascism was undergoing astronomical growth worldwide. Surrounded by a climate of extreme economic despair and alarmed by Hitler's rise to power in Germany as a Jewish man, Robert Oppenheimer was propelled into the world of left-wing politics in the 1930s. These left-wing sympathies and affiliations would haunt Oppenheimer for the rest of his life. He began engaging in anti-fascist work, funding those fleeing Nazi Germany and sending financial aid to the left-wing Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. He would then proceed to participate in various worker struggles and would become involved with a number of front organizations for the Communist Party USA. While it's unclear whether he ever actually joined the Communist Party itself, it's been noted that most of his associates, including his brother, his wife, his lovers, and his friends, were or had been Communist Party members at one point or another. Regardless of whether he was an official party member or not, Oppenheimer wrote decisively in his 1942 security questionnaire for the Manhattan Project that, "I have been a member of just about every communist front organisation on the West Coast." Joining the Manhattan Project in 1942 supposedly marked the point in Oppenheimer's life at which he fully broke away from any communist activity. Leading the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer's team successfully tested out the atomic bomb in Los Alamos, New Mexico, July 1945. Causing enormous destruction and pollution to important indigenous land. The successful testing of the bombs at Los Alamos led Oppenheimer and his team to advise on the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, causing between 110,000 and 220,000 deaths, over 85% of whom were civilians, mainly women and children, as well as hundreds of thousands of injuries both directly from the blast as well as indirectly from radiation effects. While the bombs were dropped under the pretenses of ending World War II, it's important to highlight that Hitler and Nazi Germany had already been defeated 3 months earlier, while the Japanese state was already in the process of negotiating the conditions of its own surrender. Following the war, Oppenheimer continued his work in both academia and with the US government. However, after spearheading the creation of the atomic bomb, he opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb. In response to this opposition, his security clearance was revoked in 1954. This was ideologically justified on the basis of Oppenheimer's previous communist affiliations during the new McCarthyite Red Scare, in which fascists had been defeated and the Soviets had now become the United States' #1 enemy. Having lost his security clearance, Oppenheimer retreated from governmental work and returned solely to academia until his retirement in 1966. After a lifetime of heavy smoking, Oppenheimer passed away from throat cancer on the 18th of February 1967. Leaving behind an important lasting legacy in the fields of physics and nuclear science. So that's a very brief overview of the life and times of J. Robert Oppenheimer himself. A controversial, complicated, in some ways brilliant, but deeply morally and ethically questionable individual, to put it mildly. Nice and lighthearted, yeah? Anyway, now on to the film itself. Based on 2005's American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin, 2023's Oppenheimer was written and directed by Christopher Nolan, one of the world's most famous directors today, known for critically acclaimed films like Memento, Inception, The Dark Knight Trilogy, Tenet, and Interstellar. Politically, Christopher Nolan could broadly be described as a cowardly shitlib. Did I say that? Sorry, what I meant to say was centrist with some vaguely libertarian leanings. Some have noted conservative messaging in certain films like The Dark Knight Rises, while others have described liberal anti-war themes in films like Tenet. While Christopher Nolan usually refrains from discussing his own political views directly, OpenSecrets.org reveals that he was a donor for Barack Obama's 2012 US presidential campaign. So, make of that what you will. Christopher Nolan began work on Oppenheimer in late 2021, though he claims to have intended on making such a film about Oppenheimer for over 20 years. Cillian Murphy was then quickly brought on board as the titular star of the movie, and pre-production had begun by January 2022. Similarly swiftly, filming wrapped up entirely in May 2022, with teaser trailers emerging shortly after in July 2022. Oppenheimer premiered the following year on the 16th of July 2023, coinciding with the 78th anniversary of the first detonation of the atomic bomb in Los Alamos. At the premiere, film stars Cillian Murphy, Emily Blunt, Matt Damon and others left early in solidarity with the then announced SAG-AFTRA strike against increasingly exploitative working conditions in the entertainment industry. Oppenheimer was released to the general public on the 21st of July, the same day as the Barbie movie. While Oppenheimer has been near universally acclaimed, achieving a 93% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes and 88 out of 100 on Metacritic, its success has been partially overshadowed by that of Barbie, with which Oppenheimer is often compared and contrasted. As of the 2nd of September, Oppenheimer has made an impressive $853 million at the box office worldwide. However, as of the same date, Barbie has amassed an eye-watering $1.38 billion at the same global box office. So while Oppenheimer is certainly performing respectably well in its own right, excitement is being tempered by the fact that it's more or less getting left in the dust behind Barbie.
That makes total sense to me for two reasons. Number one, the soundtrack. Did Nicki Minaj and Ice Spice drop an absolute banger for Oppenheimer or for Barbie? Scratch that. Did Ryan Gosling drop the song of the year for Barbie or Oppenheimer? Secondly, what are you supposed to wear to watch Oppenheimer? Because I know I'm not going to be caught dead wearing a fedora, and you can't even chain smoke in the movie theaters anymore. And what are you going to wear, like a suit and get it all greased up with popcorn butter? No thank you. But what you can wear is an Instagrammable hot pink two-piece to Greta Gerwig's little moving picture, so there's a clear winner in this situation.
I got on just fine in my hot pink two-piece at Oppenheimer, but that's neither here nor there. Now that we've looked at the background of both J. Robert Oppenheimer himself, as well as the 2023 film, its release, its Instagrammability, or lack thereof, let's dive into a discussion of the film and its politics. So first, Anna, did you enjoy this film?
Yeah, I enjoyed the film. I actually really did, especially for such a long film. I, as someone who's from the TikTok era, and thus I have the attention span of a goldfish, I felt like I was not bored at any point during it. That's probably a mixture of the storyline, the soundtrack was really good, and the visuals. That was my favorite part of the movie, to be honest with you. There's so many beautiful shots of the universe, just like galaxies and space and star formation, and I absolutely loved it. And of course, the acting was phenomenal, but I feel like I don't even have to mention that because Cillian Murphy is in this movie. Cillian Murphy did as amazing as you would expect him to, and there was also a really long list of amazing actors and actresses part of this movie, so you can't be bored with that roster. Now, did I enjoy the messaging and historical point of view of the film? That's a little more complicated. I know this is very commie killjoy of me, but I don't like great man theory attempts at teaching history, and so I knew from the very title of this film that I was gonna have criticisms. And after watching it, I have to confirm that there are various scenes in this movie that make me very uncomfortable with a historical understanding of the events that the movie was trying to cover. More specifically, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Red Scare in the United States, the displacement of indigenous people for the Manhattan Project and its after effects, and finally, the Spanish Civil War. The problem with these great man theory films is that the historical atrocities that are covered in these films are always diluted into individual moments in the great man main character's life in which he experiences personal guilt, an internal dilemma, or a hero's call in response to it, effectively downplaying the real and raw tragedy that happened against actual people into a plot point in the life of said great man. The most obvious example of this in the movie is how it covered the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's already something to be said about an American film trying to address the bombing of those two cities in Japan and subsequent colonization of Japan by making a film dramatizing the life of the man who created the bombs that caused such destruction and killed up to 220,000 Japanese people and injured up to 650,000 others, and painting him out to be a good guy who should be separated from the devastation that his creation caused. Even though in the film they showed that he was definitely for dropping the bomb on Japan and was involved in the decision making of where to drop it. So he knew the civilian population, and he even calculated how many people he thought was gonna die. And it was only after they dropped the bomb, and I guess more civilians were killed than he thought, or he realized, hey, actually, maybe it was not good to, drop bombs on civilians. Did he feel he had blood on his hands, and then think twice about creating such a weapon for the United States? It's a reflection, in my opinion, of who the intended audience of this movie is. Americans. And to be fair, with the intended audience of Americans in mind, the film did drive home the fact that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a horrible atrocity, a literal war crime committed by the United States against the people of Japan, not because of the myth that we were taught that because if not, Japan wouldn't have surrendered, because Orientals and their honor culture, but for the real reason, which was depicted in this film, which was because the United States wanted to intimidate the Soviet Union. For an overwhelmingly anti-communist American audience, which still believes in Cold War propaganda that the USSR was an evil empire that was taking over the world and threatening them with communism and authoritarianism, and the United States, of course, in this situation was the defender, bad Soviet Union. I think this is actually very anti-status quo, and I commend the directors and writers of this film for doing that. But I've spoken to a lot of Japanese comrades and friends who watched this movie in an American movie theater, and their experience watching this movie is very different. What I gathered from them, as well as other reviews that I've read online from Japanese Americans and Japanese migrant workers here in the United States watching this movie, they said it was really hard to watch a film about the man who created the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's much harder to watch it in a movie theater filled with Americans who were cheering when the bomb was dropped in Los Alamos and proved that the bomb was successful, that were laughing when, during the security meeting, the guy made the comment that they shouldn't bomb Kyoto because that's where my wife and I honeymooned and it's so beautiful there. Ironically, in that scene in the movie where Oppenheimer is delivering a speech to an American audience on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're all cheering and waving an American flag, and all he can hear is the screams of terror in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that scene pretty accurately represents what many Japanese people felt like watching this movie in an American movie theater, which is pretty dark. And just to clarify, not that I feel like I need to because all of you guys know I'm a Filipino Marxist, but many of you guys don't know that my great-grandfather was killed by the Japanese colonizers in the Philippines during World War II. I'm obviously not a fan of the Empire of Japan, and that's not what I'm defending. 85% of the victims of these bombings were civilians. Mostly normal, working-class people who just had the misfortune of being born in a fascist state. The United States specifically set out to bomb areas with high civilian populations. Just like we do with every single country We separate the working class of that country from the atrocities of the ruling class. And we should do the same when we're talking about the atrocities committed by the United States against the Japanese people. We need to separate the Japanese people from the brutal, colonialist, imperialist empire of Japan, which, to be fair, I think the film does pretty well. But enough of my rambling. What do you think about it, Paul?
No, you're not rambling at all. They're actually very good points. As for myself, I'd probably be a little bit biased because I've loved Cillian Murphy ever since his performance in The Wind That Shakes the Barley. He's very much a clear-cut hero in that film, whereas obviously in Oppenheimer he's a bit more, we'll say, ambiguous. The acting again is incredible, the sets, the almost psychedelic special effects, the music, all of it, The film really is an aesthetic feast. However, what we're most interested in today are the politics of the film. This, of course, is at the front and centre of Oppenheimer, as the film bases itself primarily around the McCarthyite Red Scare trials of 1954, in which Oppenheimer's earlier sympathies and associations with communists in the 1930s and early 40s would lead him to having his Q clearance revoked by the US state security apparatus. So the film provided an interesting canvas through which questions of ethics, freedom of speech, anti-communism and jingoism could be grappled with. At the same time, I'd share the concerns regarding the missed opportunity to highlight the struggles of Indigenous peoples in US claimed territory, beyond one brief passing remark. Particularly with how they were forced to vacate the area that would be used to set up the Los Alamos National Laboratory, as well as the enormous damage caused to the land, the flora and the fauna by both the blast of the atomic bomb tested in the area, as well as the radiation damage that it caused. The negative effects of radiation in the wake of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings weren't really highlighted either. Simply showing a photograph of the damage that radiation exposure caused hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese civilians would have gone a long way in helping the film to carve out a clear political stance with regard to these events. We'll get into it more over the course of this conversation, but there was often a frustratingly centrist perspective to this film that you'll see emerging again and again on matters where there really isn't any room for fence-sitting. So anyway, yes, I was entertained by the film overall. I found it aesthetically pleasing and intellectually stimulating, to a degree. But I also found it deeply frustrating and politically ignorant, and honestly, straight up goofy as shit at one point in particular. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's dive into one of the big questions that hovers over this film. Was Robert Oppenheimer himself actually a communist?
So I just want to preface this by saying that I don't think that the film very accurately depicted what J. Robert Oppenheimer's real political views were, and I think that the real-life Oppenheimer had a better understanding of what communism and Marxism are than the scriptwriters of this film, who clearly do not. This man, in real life, hung out with a lot of Marxists. His brother was a Marxist. His wife used to be a Marxist. And of course, he had a long-term relationship with a Marxist woman, a years-long relationship, during which they probably talked about Marxism or argued about it various times. That being said, no, I don't think that the real-life Oppenheimer was a communist, but I just don't think that he was an anti-communist, and bear with me on this one. Something interesting which was depicted in the film, which I don't know if it accurately applies to Oppenheimer himself, but does have a basis in history, is that Oppenheimer and many Jewish leftists had a very big problem with CPUSA's non-interventionist stance regarding Nazi Germany during the era of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was the non-aggression pact that was signed between the USSR and Nazi Germany, which lasted less than 2 years, to be fair. Even though CPUSA changed its stance as soon as the pact was broken, because, Nazi Germany invaded the USSR, which was the primary reason why the USSR signed this pact to prevent that and save its people. This is still very much a recorded tension that did actually happen between leftist factions in the United States during World War II. Now, that doesn't mean that the pact itself was bad, and a historical understanding as to why the USSR, who was very ideologically opposed to Nazism, before, during, and after the pact was signed it, is very important. Also, it doesn't mean that the CPUSA, even during the time which they had this stance in regards to Nazi Germany, didn't stand up against Nazism and anti-Semitism in the United States and abroad, because they did. And I also don't want to generalize and say that all Jewish leftists were not inclined to join the Communist Party or were against this stance by CPUSA, because as the saying goes, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And there was many members of the Communist Party of the United States who were Jewish during this time, even during the time that they had this stance in regards to Nazi Germany. But yes, it makes a lot of sense that a leftist such as Oppenheimer, who was radicalized into left-wing politics primarily because of his hatred of Nazi Germany, or at least in big part to it, would be disgusted and appalled by the Communist Party of the United States' stance regarding Nazi Germany during this era. But again, though likely, we actually don't know if this had anything to do with the fact that J. Robert Oppenheimer appears to never have actually joined the Communist Party of the United States. It's more so just speculation. Overall, I do agree with the film's depiction of Oppenheimer as a champagne socialist. Oppenheimer was a bourgeois intellectual who held pro-union and anti-fascist views. He sent money to the Spanish Republicans through the CPUSA, and he raised money to get Jewish, socialist, and anti-fascist scientists out of Nazi Germany. But, as depicted in the film, Oppenheimer seems to look down at communists and not agree with their aims. But he doesn't see them as harmful and appears to think that their heart is in the right place. Which again, in the context of the film's intended audience, Americans, this is a pretty anti-status quo message to try to convey to them, that communists aren't evil demons hiding in your walls, getting ready to steal your toothbrush. Oppenheimer, the protagonist of this film, is more than willing to work with communists to unionize the laboratory, and is seen in various moments hiding the identity of his communist friends and protecting them from the American security forces. And he doesn't want to go to war with the USSR, and doesn't, like many characters in this film, see communism as bad or worse than fascism. So much so that he is unjustly targeted by the United States government. But what about you, Paul? Do you think Oppie was a commie?
Well, Oppie the Commie certainly has a nice ring to it, and there are people who have attempted to argue that he was actually a Soviet spy, but I wouldn't be thoroughly convinced. Oppenheimer was someone who was intellectually interested in communism and engaged in some forms of socialist organising when it suited him. But it's unclear whether he would ever, as they say in the film, toe the party line and come under communist democratic centralism. With that said, it's important to distinguish between Robert Oppenheimer himself in real life versus film Oppenheimer portrayed on screen. Christopher Nolan's own shitlib politics are evident in the portrayal of Oppenheimer as an infinitely free thinker who could never be bound by the tight confines of small-minded party discipline, groupthink, or any other forms of evil collectivism. Did I say shitlib instead of centrist again? Fuck it, I stand by it. Look, there certainly is a real-life material basis for Oppenheimer holding a bourgeois individualist worldview due to his extremely privileged upbringing. But this free thinker aspect is really exaggerated in the film, so it's worth considering this question on 2 levels. Was real-life Oppenheimer a communist, and was film Oppenheimer a communist? In real life, I think it's fair to say that he was sympathetic to communism ideologically, but he didn't go all in on it. In the movie, however, there's one scene quite early on that demonstrates perfectly just how shallow film Oppenheimer's understanding of communism really is. Get ready for some grade A goofiness. About 23 minutes into the film, attempting to impress Gene Tatlock with his supposedly educated Marxist credentials, Oppenheimer claims to have read all 3 volumes of Das Kapital. Word to the wise, anyone who's claiming to have read Das Kapital probably hasn't actually read it. The work is simply called Capital in English, so unless they're fluent in German, they're probably talking shite. Film Oppenheimer himself, however, has an excuse. He claims to have read it in the original German. And in supposedly reading Marx's Capital in German, he came away from reading Capital specifically with the idea that, wait for it, ownership is theft. Jean Tatlock then quickly corrects him by saying that property is theft, as though she, as a communist, curiously, upholds this idea. Oppenheimer explains his confusion by claiming that it was a translation error due to reading it, Capital, in German. There's just one problem there, Oppie. Nowhere in Capital is it claimed that either ownership or property themselves are theft. The slogan, property is theft, comes from the French anarchist Proudhon. In fact, Marx actually criticised this slogan in a letter to J.B. Schweitzer in 1865, as theft is a legal construct created by the ruling propertied classes. But nowhere is this mentioned in Capital, which is the text or series of texts that they're specifically talking about. This slogan has nothing to do with Capital. Christopher Nolan hasn't read the book, and it shows. Studying the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital takes years to work through and fully comprehend. This isn't some light weekend reading by the beach. And if you are someone who's actually worked through the 3 volumes of Capital, then you aren't going to be someone who's regurgitating such shallow elementary misconceptions about Marxism. It's akin to saying, I spent years studying the collective works of Marx and Engels, mastering the dialectical materialist methods. But then I finally realised human nature, no iPhone, Vuvuzela, 300 gorillion. So now I no longer want to raise taxes and have big government like Marx advocated. Look at how smart and nuanced I am. Checkmate, commie. This is your brain on Christopher Nolan's smug-arsed enlightened centrism, folks. This is what being a free thinker who doesn't toe the party line gets you. Pure pseudo-intellectualism. So I think it's probably fair to say that while real-life Oppenheimer was certainly interested in communism in the 1930s and 40s, film Oppenheimer's supposed communism is painfully shallow and ill-informed at best. And I think, as mentioned by Anna earlier, that this is very much playing into the filmmaker's expected misconceptions held by a mainstream cinema-going audience who perhaps hasn't actually studied these matters in depth, rather than reflecting real-life Oppenheimer's actual intellectual rigor when studying Marxism himself. And finally, in terms of his practice, it's also worth highlighting that film Oppenheimer was portrayed as organising professors and students into unions near the beginning of the movie. But he's happy enough to immediately drop this the second it becomes possible for him to start working on the Manhattan Project. So not only is his theory shallow, but his commitment to actually organising in practice is also extremely weak, demonstrating an incredibly fragile, wavering commitment to workers' liberation at best. Certainly not the level of commitment that one would expect from any kind of serious communist organiser. And again, this is film Oppenheimer. Real-life Oppenheimer's practice is less clear. But anyway, speaking of communism and broadening out beyond just Oppenheimer himself as an individual, how is communism itself portrayed in this film overall? Positively, negatively, or somewhere in between?
So in this movie, communism isn't actually viewed as evil, which, just to demonstrate how cucked by capital we are here in America, is a huge improvement on how communism is usually depicted in American and Western media in general. The only people in this movie who refer to communism in a staunchly negative light are people who are clearly villains or antagonists in the film, which I think is pretty cool. We are influenced by the media we consume, yes, but we also influence the media and the overall societal superstructure. The influence of progressive movements in recent years is really evident here. And I'm really happy to see American movies such as Oppenheimer and, as we previously discussed, Barbie, depict people who hold anti-capitalist views in a positive or neutral light. And I wonder how the rising numbers of progressive and anti-capitalist people here in the United States had an influence on this. Small wins, I guess. However, in the movie, communism is still viewed as something that people believe in until they die foolishly for it or grow up. In other words, communism is not taken seriously as an ideology. It's infantilized. Its intricacies and arguments shut down by typical unclever, shit-lived, centrist, thought-terminating cliches. Most communists in this film are spoken about and depicted as immature, brainwashed, dogmatic, obsessed with their ideology. And all former communists propagate this, with a perfect example being Kitty Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer's wife. One of the most blood-boiling moments for me watching this movie was in the scene in which Kitty Oppenheimer has a monologue about her former husband, who was an international brigadier for the Spanish Civil War and died fighting for the Republicans. Ideology got Joe killed for nothing, she says. And Oppenheimer quite correctly responds, the Spanish Republic isn't nothing. But she doubles down by saying, my husband threw away our future by stopping one fascist bullet from launching itself into a mud bank. That is the definition of nothing. As someone actually from Spain, this kind of snide remark in reference to the brave international brigadiers who gave their life to help the Spanish people defend the sovereignty of our republic against the fascist hordes of Francisco Franco, who collaborated and allowed Nazi Germany and fascist Italy to bomb and kill Spanish civilians for defending our republic and violently repress national liberation movements within the state, is frankly incredibly offensive. The line is delivered in the movie by someone that we're supposed to see as, though morally gray, wise and intelligent in comparison to those hive mind, naive commies. Also, I highly doubt that the real Kitty Oppenheimer would ever say something like that, especially in regards to her first husband. Just as J. Robert Oppenheimer said in response to such a statement by her, sounds kind of reductive. This complaint kind of goes in line with my overall critique of trying to teach about historical events through a great man theory kind of approach to it. Because most Americans don't know anything about the Spanish Civil War. They don't understand the devastation and the destruction to our country that happened during it. They don't understand that we were bombed by the Nazis. They don't understand that we were the first battleground, the first place where people volunteered to go abroad to fight and try to defeat Nazis. They don't understand that the United States, that Britain, that many countries either purposely did not get involved in trying to defend our republic because they were sympathetic to or preferred fascism over our republic, which mind you, our republic was not even socialist, okay? It was just not fascist. Most Americans don't understand that. Most Americans don't know anything about the Spanish Civil War. And those who do just see it as this fantasy battleground between different leftist factions, and they just use it as a way to argue against other leftists who they don't agree with about what side of the Spanish Civil War on the Popular Front side is to blame for the fall of the Spanish Republic. So I feel like it was incredibly irresponsible for this movie to talk about the Spanish Civil War in such a manner, because it only feeds into this American ideal of the Spanish Civil War, of a war between fascists and disunited leftists, and oh my god, if only the Spanish Civil War was still around. Oh, viva la Quinta Brigada. I love George Orwell. But the worst depiction of a communist in this movie, in my opinion, was the depiction of Jean Tatlock. Jean Tatlock was a real woman, and by all accounts, she was a principled and studied member of the Communist Party of the United States. She also unfortunately struggled with clinical depression, part of which was possibly due to her sexuality. By today's standards, we would probably classify Jean Tatlock as being bisexual. But during the time that she was alive, same-sex attraction was viewed as a disease that could be eradicated through emotional, physical, and psychological torture and medication. I get that the movie's about Oppenheimer. I do. I understand that there is no need to go into a deep dive into Jean Tatlock's story, and she does not need to come out more than is needed for the plot line in Oppenheimer's story. I get it. But how do I put this politely? It seemed that Jean Tatlock only existed in this storyline to give men boners. More than half the time she's on screen, she is naked or partially naked, and her and Oppenheimer are or were just having sex. Listen, we all know they had a sexual relationship, okay? And that is not wrong to depict because it's historically accurate. But they didn't just have that type of relationship. They had a very intellectual and loving relationship. They almost got married twice. Oppenheimer respected and loved Jean, and anything he might have known about Marxism and communism probably came from her. Which, in my opinion, is such a missed opportunity to have a scene where Oppenheimer and Jean are discussing communism and she explains parts of the ideology to him, even if it was like an argument scene where they're disagreeing with each other, but Jean is still getting her point across. It would help in the overall storyline that is trying to depict, the oppressive and unethical nature of anti-communist persecution by humanizing someone like Jean. But she's not humanized as a communist in this movie, she's objectified. And instead of getting those cool scenes that we could have had between her and Oppenheimer talking about communism, arguing about communism, we get written by a man scenes, such as the very first scene between her and Oppenheimer, where she just stops abruptly during, the session. She goes over to get a book that's off the wall, and she just opened it in front of her, and she was like, "Can you read Sanskrit? Read it to me while I write you." Like normal people do, right? Like as any woman would ever do. That. And listen, I get it. I understand that a Hollywood movie will never accurately depict what communism is. And I understand that a shot of Florence Pugh's boobs is going to get higher ratings than Florence Pugh playing a historically accurate communist woman, or a woman in general, who was more than just a hot side piece and could very intricately explain what Marxism is. But maybe, have we thought, that maybe Hollywood should stop making movies surrounding the topic of communism then? And then claim that it's a historical film? And maybe just stop making biographical films about people who were communists or associated with communists in general?
Aside from Greta Gerwig's Barbie, obviously. A true proletarian revolutionary classic.
All hail Greta Gerwig, the 15th head of Marxism.
All hail Chairwoman Greta. But yeah, I get what you mean. It's really frustrating to see Marxism so deeply misrepresented and distorted, even in films like this, which aren't explicitly anti-communists. And in fact, is a film that deals with the dangers of anti-communism and the Red Scare hysteria surrounding Oppenheimer's early political affiliations. But overall, while the film presents Oppenheimer himself as an individual as being intellectually sympathetic to communism, and this is treated as being just fine, that doesn't mean that the film itself sympathizes with communism. It is, in a certain sense, anti-communist by opposing anti-communism, but this shouldn't be mistaken to necessarily mean that the film is pro-communist. The overall impression that you get from the film is that it's good to study communism and learn about it from an intellectual perspective, but that you should be cautious in doing so, taking care to remain a free thinker who doesn't toe any party's line. And as you've mentioned, refreshingly, communists aren't demonized. Communists are just treated like normal people in this film, which might make it seem more radical than it actually is due to the viciously anti-communist environment that many of us exist in. When you're constantly bombarded with right-wing propaganda 24 hours a day, simple centrist liberal positions like this can appear quite left-wing by comparison because the Overton window of acceptable political discourse has shifted so far to the right, and terms like left and right are relative by their very nature. So moving on now from solely how the film handles communism, can we summarise a general political outlook of the film? What is this film trying to say politically?
Yeah, so one of the main messages of this film is a nonpartisan plea against war, against fascism, and for diplomacy between countries instead of threatening each other with nuclear war. Another message of this movie is to not trust the good intentions of your government. At the beginning of this movie, there's a scene where Oppenheimer is trying to convince one of his fellow scientists to join the Manhattan Project, and his hesitant friend says, "I don't want 300 years of physics to culminate into the creation of a weapon of mass destruction." And so Oppenheimer's response is, "I don't know what the United States wants to do with this weapon, but I know what Nazi Germany wants to do with this weapon." In other words, he trusts that the United States will use this weapon more responsibly as a way to intimidate Nazi Germany and threaten them to stop them from using their own atomic bomb against Jewish people, the Soviet people, and other innocents. However, this trust in the United States is broken the moment that the United States drops this bomb on a civilian population in order to threaten the USSR. This proves to Oppenheimer that the United States has done what he feared Nazi Germany would do. Finally, through the example of the persecution of Oppenheimer by the United States because of his opposition to a nuclear arms race between them and the USSR in the wake of the devastation and destruction that the nuclear weapons caused the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the film calls out the hypocrisy of a country which propagandizes itself as a believer in freedom of speech and non-authoritarianism. This point remains incredibly relevant today. Asylum seekers and migrant workers who have or have been affiliated with a communist party in the past are still inadmissible in the United States. In other words, unless you go through actual hell with immigration in the United States, you are not allowed to become a citizen of the United States or even be in the United States if you've ever been part of or are currently part of a communist party in a foreign country. I personally know a lot of people who are undocumented or currently fighting with immigration services in the United States because of this. What's more, the Federal Communist Control Act of 1954, which made communist membership or support for communism illegal, is still very much in effect. And several states have their own laws which outlaw communist parties, membership, and don't allow communists from holding certain jobs or running for office. While it's not as enforced as it used to be, that doesn't mean it isn't enforced sometimes. Literally this year, the Communist Party of Oklahoma was denied a booth at the Pride Festival of the city because of a law enacted in 1955 in the state, which made the Communist Party illegal. And just in 2017, a Brooklyn school principal called Jill Bloomberg was put under investigation for communist affiliations after she complained about segregation, over-policing, and racial inequity in New York public schools. Sound familiar? And finally, the United States has gone as far as labeling communist parties and revolutionaries abroad who are actively waging anti-colonial and worker-led revolutions against their states as terrorist organizations. They do this in an effort to criminalize anyone who supports or is sympathetic to their cause, and to silence, dox, and harass diaspora grassroots organizers here in the United States, like Filipino Americans, part of National Democratic Movement organizations, or Palestinian Americans, part of organizations such as Students for Justice in Palestine, Within Our Lifetime, and Palestinian Youth Movement. Anything else I forgot to add, coworker Rad?
So I think that there were some key points that this film was trying to make, some of which have been touched on already. Firstly, being dogmatically anti-communist is silly. It's for silly, silly geese. The Red Scare McCarthyites in the film are presented as fanatical lunatics. Their actions halted scientific progress in many regards, with numerous important scientists persecuted for having pro-communist sympathies. And it's hinted that anti-communism contributed heavily to starting the Cold War with the Soviet Union following World War II. At the same time, the film opposes dogmatically upholding communism itself, and is certainly skeptical of communist parties organisationally, demanding wiggle room for individuals, as though joining a communist party necessarily means you can no longer think for yourself. The upshot of this is that it encourages the viewer to be an enlightened, centrist, freethinker shitlib like Christopher Nolan. Nope, no corrections this time, I stand by it. Next, as Anna has alluded to, the film also raises a point about the importance of free speech, highlighting the hypocrisy of the United States presenting itself internationally as the land of freedom and democracy, while engaging in extremely authoritarian Orwellian practices against anyone even remotely left-wing during the Red Scare. It comes across that free speech is only tolerated as far as that free speech is aligned with US government policy. Free speech for those who support capitalism, but persecution and punishment for those who are in any way critical of it. And the final political message, or perhaps a warning, that I believe this film is putting across is the necessity of keeping scientific and technological advances under strict control, as these advances will be used by those in power towards whatever ends they seek, regardless of the intentions of those who create it. In the film, we see this with the atomic bomb, which Oppenheimer himself had hoped would end all war once and for all, and then later with the development of the hydrogen bomb. In today's world, we're seeing a striking parallel with the rapid technological advancement of artificial intelligence. Specifically, technology like GPT-4 and future iterations, which scientists are increasingly unable to explain the inner workings of. This technological development is occurring at a rapid and exponentially growing pace which humanity is simply unable to keep up with. And what this means for our future is uncertain. It's like we're building a ship, but we don't know how to steer it in a direction that ultimately benefits humanity. So we don't know where the ship is going to take us. It might lead us to heaven, but it also might take us to hell. In my opinion at least, this is probably the most interesting and original political message or warning that we can extract from Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Now, returning to the broader political perspective of the film, overall I think it's fair to say that the movie has a pretty clear liberal outlook and worldview. It's not necessarily conservative. There are perhaps certain libertarian leanings. It's definitely not a communist or a socialist film. It's very much again the enlightened centrist, with perhaps some vaguely humanistic sentiments. However, it has to be said that these humanistic sentiments are quite unevenly applied across the entirety of the human race. Specifically, there's an acute lack of extending these sentiments to the native people affected by the US state's nuclear activity in Los Alamos, as well as to the enormous numbers of Japanese civilians whose lives were taken or destroyed by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Alright, so, final question now. Anna, what do you rate Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer out of 10?
Okay, so cinematography and soundtrack wise, I would give it a 9 out of 10. Phenomenal. Storyline wise, 6 out of 10 because yes, Oppenheimer, very interesting, morally gray person. But they depicted him a little too light gray. Politics-wise, I'll give 2 ratings. In the context of introducing an overwhelmingly anti-communist, propagandize American audience to an alternative view of history that combats historical revisionism surrounding the Manhattan Project, anti-communist lies, and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I think it did a great job. The second rating is without the context of who the intended audience is supposed to be and just solely looking at the politics. For a movie that's supposed to be talking about the Red Scare and McCarthyism, I think it did a very, very poor job at discussing the ideology that was being persecuted, communism, and the main victims of said persecution, communists. Also, I think the film barely addressed the violence which the Manhattan Project unleashed on the indigenous land in Los Alamos, which it used as a testing site, the effects of which are still being felt both by the land and the indigenous people of that land to this day. And its use of the great man theory way of trying to teach historical events left a lot to be desired. So overall, I would give it 6.5 out of 10. But what about you, Paul?
In terms of sheer enjoyability, the aesthetics, how engaging the subject matter is, I'd probably give Oppenheimer an 8 out of 10. You certainly won't be bored while watching it. But in terms of its politics, I don't think it's anywhere near as nuanced and complex as it would like to present itself as being. It's just bog standard shitlib centrism based on superficial pseudo-intellectual political cliches. I'd give it 5 out of 10, but it would probably be lower if not for raising the importance of keeping technological developments under control and the current parallels with artificial intelligence. So overall, between the entertainment and the politics, Oppenheimer also gets a 6.5 out of 10 from me. Looks like Barbie continues to reign supreme with 7.5 out of 10. Sorry, Oppie.
Christopher Nolan, embrace the immortal science of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Marxism Today. If you'd like to support our little left-wing media co-op, please consider joining our Patreon. The link is below, and as always, a massive thank you to all our current supporters.
Thank you to the legendary Jess, Christian Napales, Rotgardist, Jason Schmitz, Julia Affentranger, Blue Collar Reds, BJB7, The Class Traitor, Jorio4, Christiander, Andrew Smith, Michael Oxlong, Citizen Smiths, The Leninist Lawyer, James Bennett, Engels Beards, Jackson Lenkovich, Sleepy Nicks, Borkzilla, Andrew Fisher, Joe Boy Forever, love it, Geef and Comrade D. Gurv Mil Magwiv agus Slongafol.
Buenas tardes, noches y mañanas, casamas. Adiós y shalom.